Montana Territory, June 1887, the thunder cracked so loud it shook the rotting beams above her head. Frankie Sutton pressed her back hard against the cold barn wall, clutching the frayed wool blanket tighter around her shoulders. Wind howled through gaps in the planks, sending dust and bits of hay spinning through the air. Her boots were soaked, her skirts clung to her legs, and the storm raged like it meant to rip the whole world apart. The barn was half collapsed, leaning to one side like it had given up trying to stand straight. Rain poured through a busted section of roof, pooling around the moldy feed troughs. Frankie had stumbled across it just before the worst of the storm hit. She had not planned to stop, she had not planned on much of anything, but when the first bolt of lightning struck too close, she had ducked inside and stayed. Her fingers trembled as she tucked her braid under the blanket. She was not crying. She had told herself she would not cry. But her breath shook every time thunder rolled over the hills. She had not eaten since before sunrise. She had walked over 15 miles, maybe more, from the last homestead she passed. Her palms were raw from pulling herself up a muddy slope when her horse had spooked and bolted. She had no idea where it had gone. She had nothing left but the bag under her arm, a change of clothes, and a crumpled letter she could not bring herself to open again. Then the barn door creaked. Frankie's heart stopped. She pressed herself flatter against the wall, eyes wide. The wind had pushed that door open earlier. It had slammed shut again too. But this was slow, heavy. Footsteps. A tall figure stepped into the dark, shaking water from his hat. His coat was soaked through, rain dripping from the brim. He was broad-shouldered, muddy from the knees down, and carried himself with a quiet steadiness that did not match the chaos outside. His eyes adjusted to the dim light and settled on her. "I ain't here to hurt you," the man said, voice rough but calm. "Saw the barn from the ridge. Storm's getting mean, figured someone might be in it." Frankie did not move. Her pulse pounded in her ears. He took his hat off slowly like he was trying not to spook a skittish colt. His hair was dark and wet, stuck to his forehead. "You all right?" "I am fine," she said, though her voice cracked. "Please, just let me be." He crouched by the door, set his hat down on a bale, and took off his gloves. "Name's Jonah Keller. I was driving cattle south when the storm rolled in. My horse threw a shoe, been walking near 2 hours. Not much shelter out here, just this." Frankie gripped the blanket tighter. Jonah did not come closer. He stayed by the door, leaned his back against the wall, and looked up at the cracked rafters. "You been in here long?" he asked after a minute. She nodded once. "You got anyone coming for you?" She shook her head. Jonah was quiet for a while. The wind shook the barn again, and somewhere outside a tree split with a crack. "You hungry?" he asked. Her stomach twisted at the word. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a wrapped piece of jerky and a small tin of dried peaches. "I ain't got much, but it's better than nothing." She did not move. Jonah did not push. He set the food on a dry patch of wood near her and stepped back again. "I can sit over there if it makes you feel better." She looked at him for the first time. His face was weathered, sun-browned, with a faint scar near his left temple and eyes the color of dried wheat. He looked tired, but not unkind. "You are not going to take anything from me?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Jonah's jaw tightened. "No, ma'am," she nodded once. That was all she had the strength for. He moved to the far side of the barn and lowered himself to the floor. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the rain and creaking wood. After a while, she reached for the food. The jerky was tough, but she chewed slowly, grateful. She ate the peaches last, one by one, letting the sweetness linger on her tongue. She had not tasted something like that in weeks. "I am Frankie," she said finally. "Frankie Sutton." Jonah tipped his head. "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Sutton." She gave a small laugh, the sound foreign in her throat. "I do not think we are in much of a position for pleasantries." "Storm will pass," he said. "They always do." Frankie rested her head against the wall, not all of them. Jonah did not press her. He just nodded again, and the quiet settled back between them. She did not know when she closed her eyes, but she woke with a start hours later. The storm still raged, though the thunder had moved off in the distance. She blinked and sat up. Jonah was still there, coat wrapped around his shoulders, dozing lightly with his chin against his chest. She stood slowly, legs stiff. The blanket fell from her shoulders. She walked across the barn and sat down beside him. He stirred, looked over at her with bleary eyes. "I did not thank you," she said softly. "You do not have to. I want to." He nodded, watching her face. She looked away. "I lost everything," she whispered. "My brother died last winter. I stayed with his wife and the children, but she remarried quick. Her new husband said I was nothing but a burden, told me to leave." Jonah's brow furrowed. "I took what I could carry and walked. I do not know where I was going." Her voice broke. "I just kept walking." Jonah reached out, slow and steady, and placed his hand over hers. His palm was rough, warm. "You do not have to walk anymore," he said. Frankie looked at their hands, then up into his face. "I do not know you," she whispered. "No," he said. "You do not. But I was raised to help when I can. You need help." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. He did not try to wipe them. He just held her hand, firm and steady, in the middle of that broken barn while the storm finally began to fade. And for the first time in days, she did not feel like she had to run. She just sat there with him, letting his quiet steadiness hold her together. The sun rose behind pale clouds, casting a weak gold light across the soaked grassland. The barn groaned as the wind eased, and the air held that clean, unsettled hush that follows a long storm. Frankie sat cross-legged near the open doorway, her skirt damp but manageable, her boots beginning to dry with the new warmth. A bird called once, sharp and high, like it couldn't quite believe the sky had cleared. Jonah was outside, not far, tending to a small fire he'd coaxed to life with flint and dried straw from an old chicken coop behind the barn. She could see the careful way he moved, testing the strength of each step before placing weight, like he'd learned long ago what happened when the ground gave way beneath you. Frankie stood and stepped into the morning, the chill still clinging to her sleeves. He didn't turn when she approached, just shifted slightly and nudged a tin cup of hot water in her direction. "There's a spring just down that slope," he said. "Water's clean." She took the cup, nodding her thanks. It steamed against her lip, tasting of smoke and iron. She didn't mind. It was warm. Jonah stirred the ashes with a stick, checking the coals. "There's a ranch 5 miles east. Belongs to a family named Greeley. They take in strays sometimes. I worked there last fall before drifting north." Frankie sat on a flat stone, her knees drawn up. "You think they'd let me stay?" "They might, especially if I vouch for you." She glanced at him. "You don't even know me." He met her eyes then. "No, but I can tell you're not aimless." "That's different from being lost." Frankie looked away, startled by the way his words cut through, quiet and precise. She watched the smoke curl upward, then stood and walked a few steps toward the field. The storm had laid everything flat, grasses pushed down, branches stripped bare. "How long have you been alone?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was low. "Since last spring. My brother passed from a fever. I had plans to settle a bit after the drive, but things don't always hold." She turned to him. "You lost your brother too?" Jonah nodded once, then tossed another splinter of wood on the fire. "He was younger, always had more sense than me. I didn't expect to outlive him." They sat with that, the silence between them not unfriendly, just full of things neither of them needed to say aloud. She noticed the way he flexed his left hand when he thought no one was looking, like the joints hurt. He noticed how she kept her back to the wind, even in calm. "I can cook," she said after a while, "and so. I kept the children's clothes patched last winter." "Ranch wife passed 5 years ago," Jonah replied. "Greeley's eldest daughter runs most of the house now, could use another set of hands." Frankie hesitated, then asked, "And you plan to go with me?" He looked at her steady. "If you'll have me there." She frowned slightly, more puzzled than anything else. "Why, you've got no reason to stay tied." He gave a small shrug. "Not everything's about reason, some things just feel right." She didn't answer. Instead, she crossed the field, her boots squelching in the soft mud, and bent to retrieve a fallen horseshoe half buried near the fence. She brushed it off, ran her thumb along the curve. "Maybe the horse that left this'll cross paths with me again," she said. Jonah stood, brushing his palms on his trousers. "If it's yours, it might. They remember who fed him." She held the horseshoe for a moment longer, then tucked it into her bag. 5 miles east, you said. I'll walk with you," he replied. They left as the sky cleared further, each carrying what little they had. They didn't speak much along the way. They didn't need to. Fields rolled out to the horizon, wet and shining, and the path they took turned from mud to firm earth as the sun climbed higher. By the time the Greeley ranch house came into view, a modest structure with smoke rising from its chimney and chickens pecking the yard, Frankie's legs ached and her shoulders burned, but she didn't slow. Jonah opened the gate for her and waited. She stepped through, then turned to him. "You've done more than most would, Mr. Keller." He tilted his head slightly. "You don't have to call me that." "What should I call you then?" "Jonah's fine." She gave a quick nod, then added, "I'd like to earn my keep, not be taken in out of pity." "You've got grit," he said simply. "Folks here'll see it." Frankie stood a little straighter, the wind brushing her braid against her back. "Then I'm ready." Jonah smiled, not wide, not showy, just a quiet lifting, like something inside him had settled. They walked up the steps together. The first week at the Greeley ranch passed with a quiet rhythm that neither Frankie nor Jonah disturbed. The house itself was plain, built of river stone and pine, with a low roof and wide eaves to keep the snow from piling too heavy in winter. A windmill creaked softly behind the barn, pulling water into a trough where 2 milk cows drank side by side, tails swishing in slow unison. Frankie had been given a cot in the loft, just under the sloped rafters. It was hotter up there than below, but she didn't mind. It gave her a place to fold her thoughts at the end of each day, away from the low murmur of the Greeley family's evening talk. She kept her things in a wooden box beside the cot, and each night she laid out her dress for the next morning, smoothing the wrinkles from the sleeves with the flat of her palm. She rose early, before the light touched the hills, and worked beside Ruth Greeley in the kitchen. Ruth was a solid woman with a stern jaw and hands pink from lye soap, but she didn't press Frankie for stories. She simply showed her where the flour was kept, how much wood the stove needed to hold its heat steady, and what time Mr. Greeley liked his coffee. That was enough. Jonah had taken to helping with the younger cattle, fencing repairs, and long days out riding boundary lines with the eldest Greeley son, Levy, who barely spoke 2 words unless asked. Jonah didn't seem to mind the silence. He moved through his days with the same even pace as he had in the barn, his movements deliberate, his voice low but firm when needed. On the 8th morning, while clearing the porch of wind-blown leaves, Frankie heard Jonah's voice behind her. "Greeleys say there's a town gathering this evening. Some sort of music and supper down by the river bend. Folks bring bread, pie, whatever they've got. You planning to go?" She turned, resting the broom against the rail. "I hadn't thought about it. Ruth says they'd be glad to have you come along. She's making pickled corn and a dried apple tart." Frankie brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "I've never been to anything like that, not since I was a child." Jonah leaned on the post, arms crossed. "Might be good to see folks laughing, hear a fiddle." Frankie studied him for a moment. "You going?" "Figured I might. Greeleys could use help hauling things. You'd be welcome to ride up with me." She nodded slowly. "All right, I'll come." That evening, Ruth lent her a dress with faded blue calico and a mended hem. Frankie braided her hair tighter than usual and washed her hands twice to get the flour out from beneath her nails. When she stepped down the stairs, Jonah was waiting near the wagon, fitting the last basket under the seat. He turned when he saw her, and though he didn't say anything, something in his eyes shifted, quiet approval maybe, or just surprise. They rode in silence at first, the wagon wheels thudding over packed dirt. The breeze carried the scent of wild sage and something faintly floral. As they crested the hill, the sound of music drifted up a fiddle, steady and bright. then a second harmony winding beneath it. Frankie watched the lights flicker below, fire lamps strung between trees and lanterns swinging from wagon beds. People were already gathering, laying blankets and uncorking bottles. Laughter rose in pockets, warm and unself-conscious. "I used to think these kinds of things were for other people," she said quietly. Jonah didn't look away from the road. "What changed?" She wrapped her shawl tighter. "Maybe nothing, but I'm still here." He gave a soft exhale, not quite a laugh. "That counts for something." They unloaded the wagon near a long table where dishes were being arranged. Ruth waved them over, then turned to greet an old neighbor with a clasped hand and a cheerful shout. Frankie stood still for a moment, watching the people gather. She felt out of step, as though the earth moved beneath their feet more easily than it did hers. Jonah touched her elbow, gentle. "Let's walk a bit." They stepped away from the crowd, past the line of trees where the music softened and the air cooled. Fireflies blinked between the low branches and the grass rustled with insects settling for the night. "You were right," she said. "It's good to hear laughter again." He looked at her then, not as a stranger or a man passing through, but as someone who'd come to know her edges, the way she folded inward when uncertain, the way her voice steadied when she meant something to last. "I don't want to pass through anymore," Jonah said. She stopped walking, her hands clasped before her. "You mean that?" He nodded, the movement small. "Not much left for me on the trail, but there's something here. Something I'd stay for." Frankie took a slow breath, the night air cool in her throat. "I don't know what comes next. I've never built anything for myself before. You don't have to do it alone." She looked up at him, her face softening. "You don't talk much, but when you do, it stays with a person." Jonah stepped closer, not brushing against her, but near enough she felt the steadiness of him, the quiet certainty he carried like a second skin. "I'd like to build something with you," he said. Frankie nodded, her voice caught low in her chest. "Then let's start here." He took her hand then, warm and calloused, and they stood beneath the trees, the music drifting toward them, the night softening around their edges. Neither rushed the moment. There was time now. The summer deepened as July pressed in, thick with heat and the steady hum of grasshoppers in the fields. Dust gathered in the seams of Frankie's boots as she crossed the yard each morning, arms full of laundry or firewood or feed. The rhythm of the ranch had settled into her bones, early light through the kitchen window, soap drying on the sill, the dry creak of saddle leather from the barn before breakfast. Jonah had taken over the north fence line repairs. He came in late most days, shirt darkened with sweat, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes. The lines of his face had softened some, though he still moved with the cautious steadiness of a man who'd been left too often to trust quickly. One evening after supper, Ruth handed Frankie a tin of blackstrap molasses. "For the bread, you've a light hand with dough." Frankie set the tin beside the flour bin. "I used to help my mother. She'd hum while the dough rose, said it kept the yeast honest." Ruth smiled faintly. "You ever think of staying on here longer than the summer?" Frankie paused, the wooden scoop hovering above the flour. "That depends on more than one thing." Ruth wiped her hands on her apron. "Jonah's not the sort to say much, but he watches you like he's waiting for something to root." Frankie didn't respond. She kneaded the dough in silence, letting her weight fall into each fold. Later that night, she found Jonah in the stable, checking a swollen fetlock on one of the Greeley mares. He looked up as she stepped inside, wiping his hands on a rag. "She's favoring it less than yesterday," he said. Frankie leaned against the stall door. "Ruth asked if I'd stay through fall." Jonah studied her, quiet for a moment. "What did you tell her?" I said I hadn't decided yet. He nodded slowly, then tightened the bandage around the mare's leg. The scent of linseed and sweat hung in the air, mingling with the sweet rot of last year's hay. "You ever think about building a place of your own?" she asked. "I have." He met her gaze. "But not alone." She stepped closer, the lantern casting a low glow between them. "I never thought I'd have the chance to choose something steady. Most of my life's been about leaving before I was made to." "You don't have to leave this time." Frankie looked down at her hands, calloused now in places they hadn't been before. There's a plot east of here, near the cottonwoods. I walk past it when I go to the spring. I know the spot. It's flat, good light, close to water. She hesitated. I think it'd be enough. Jonah leaned his forearms on the stall rail, his voice low. You want to build something there with someone who'll stay. His eyes didn't leave hers. I'll stay. The lantern flickered in the draft from the open door. Frankie stepped forward until their shoulders brushed, the space between them gone quiet and full. I don't need grand promises, she said. You won't get any, Jonah replied. Just the kind I keep. They stood like that for a while, neither hurrying the moment. Outside, the moon rose behind a bank of clouds, and somewhere in the next field a coyote yipped once, then fell silent. The next morning they borrowed Levy's wagon and drove out to the cottonwood glade. Jonah walked the perimeter with her, marking the corners with stones. She pointed out where the stove would go, where she'd plant beans. He nodded, listening more than speaking. By mid-afternoon, they'd agreed to start with a single-room cabin, enough for a stove, a table, and space to sleep. Jonah would cut the timber in the hills. Frankie would sew curtains from the old feed sackcloth Ruth gave her. It would take time, but it would be theirs. As they stood beneath the cottonwoods, measuring the light, Frankie reached for his hand. You sure? She asked. Jonah gave her fingers the barest squeeze. I've never been more. By late August, the frame of their cabin stood upright beneath the cottonwoods, raw pine beams catching the sun at an angle that made even the roughest cut seem golden. Frankie set her basket down near the doorway, her arms sore from hauling bundles of thatch Ruth had helped her gather from the riverbank. Jonah was already high on the rafters, hammering in the last of the crossbeams, his shirt tied around his waist and his undershirt clinging to his back with sweat. You missed supper, she called, shading her eyes. Didn't feel like stopping, he said, voice carrying easily from above. She stepped back to better see him. You'll wear yourself out before you get that roof up. He braced the last beam and dropped his hammer onto the floorboards below with a soft thud. I wanted to finish it before the next rain. Looks like the wind's coming from the north again. It's holding, she said. Sky's too clear for weather. He climbed down the ladder and landed with a quiet thump beside her. His hands were streaked with sap and sawdust. Ruth gave me the last of her salt pork, she said. Said it's time we stop borrowing and start feeding ourselves. He smiled at that, faint but sure. You think she's eager to see us on our own? She's just ready to have her kitchen back. They walked together toward the fire pit they'd cleared beside the willows. Frankie knelt and added kindling to the coals, striking the flint until the flame caught. Jonah sat beside her, stretching his legs out, and they cooked the pork slowly, the fat spitting in the pan. You ever think about what comes after? She asked, passing him a slice once it cooled. After the cabin, she nodded, chewing carefully. Once we've planted. Once winter passes. He was quiet for a moment, then answered. I'd like to build a smokehouse, maybe a second pen, raise something besides chickens. Frankie leaned back on her hands, the firelight soft against her cheeks. I'd like to keep bees. He turned toward her. Bees? I helped a neighbor tend theirs once, back in Kansas. They're good company, honest work. I'll build you a box for them, he said. Come spring. They ate in silence for a while, the kind that didn't press, the kind that let thoughts settle before they turned into words. Frankie broke a twig between her fingers. You ever miss drifting? Jonah shook his head. I was never drifting, just looking. For what? He glanced at her then, eyes steady. This. She looked away, not because the words startled her, but because they didn't. I've been waiting for something to feel real, she said. Not borrowed, not temporary, just mine. He reached out and took her hand, rubbing his thumb across the pad of her palm. You've got that now. They stayed there until the fire burned low, until the moon rose through the trees and the crickets took over the quiet. When they stood, Jonah walked to the cabin and pulled a folded piece of paper from the inside of his satchel. Was going to wait till the roof was finished, he said. But I reckon now's as good a time as any. He handed it to her. It was a deed application, signed by Mr. Greeley and 2 other ranchers as witnesses, marked with the section number of the cottonwood plot. "You filed this," she said, reading the names. "I wanted it in both our names." Frankie didn't speak right away. She traced the ink with her fingertip, then folded it carefully and tucked it against her chest. "I never thought I'd see my name on land," she said. "You'll see it every day now," he said. "On the door, on the ledger, stitched into the quilts when we're old." She stepped forward and pressed her forehead to his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, his breath deep and even against her ear. "I want to marry you," she said. His hand stilled at the small of her back. "You sure?" "I'm sure," she said. "Not because I need safety, because I found something worth keeping." He kissed the top of her head, then pulled back to look at her. "Then we'll do it right." Before the first frost. They married before the leaves turned. A small gathering at the Greeley Ranch, Ruth sewing Frankie's dress from muslin and leftover lace, Levy carving a cedar box for the rings. Jonah wore his cleanest shirt and boots polished with bare grease. Frankie braided wildflowers into her hair. After the vows, they returned to the cabin, now finished, with a roof tight against the wind and shutters that latched. The hearth crackled with split oak, and the windows glowed warm into the night. That winter, they kept each other warm beneath thick quilts, reading by lamplight and writing letters to neighbors farther out. Jonah carved a cradle before the first snow fell, not because it was needed yet, but because his hands wanted something to shape for the future. Spring brought bees, just like she said. He built their box beside the garden, and she planted rows of beans, corn, and turnips. He added a lean-to for tools. She hung curtains the color of wheat. They didn't rush anything. Their love grew in the way seeds do under frost line, quiet, unseen, until the thaw reveals what's taken root. Years later, their porch bore the scuff marks of children's boots, and the smokehouse held shelves of salted meat. Jonah's hair turned silver at the temples. Frankie's hands grew strong, steady, and sure. But every morning they still walked the field together before breakfast, their fingers laced, the wind at their backs. They lived every day like it had been chosen. And it had. By them for each other. A life built not from chance, but from the long, steady work of love.